In this episode, we're going to treat consent as a user journey, not as a checkbox, because beginners often learn consent as a legal word and then struggle to translate it into an experience that real people can understand and actually control. A consent journey is the full path a person takes from first encountering a request for data use, through making a choice, through seeing the consequences of that choice, and then being able to change that choice later without feeling trapped. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist (CIPT) exam, consent shows up as a practical design problem because the exam is measuring whether you can connect transparency, user expectations, and enforcement into something consistent. Many systems fail not because they lack a consent mechanism, but because the mechanism is confusing, buried, or disconnected from the processing it supposedly controls. When users don't understand what they are choosing, their consent is not meaningful, and when systems don't enforce the choice reliably, the journey becomes performative and trust collapses. By the end, you should be able to describe what a good consent journey looks like, what commonly breaks it, and how to design it so it scales across complex data flows. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong consent journey begins with the idea that consent is not simply a yes or no, but an informed, voluntary, and specific agreement to a particular processing purpose under particular conditions. That means the journey starts before the button, because people need context before they can choose intelligently. If a system asks for agreement without explaining why the data is needed or what will happen to it, the user's decision becomes guesswork, and guesswork is not the kind of consent that builds trust. Consent also depends on meaningful alternatives, because a choice isn't really voluntary if the user must agree to unrelated processing to access basic functionality. In privacy technology work, this shows up as separating necessary processing from optional processing and ensuring optional processing is truly optional. Beginners sometimes assume the easiest path is to put everything in one consent request, but that creates confusion and often creates consent fatigue, where users click through without reading. A well-designed consent journey reduces cognitive load by asking for agreement only when needed, in a way that matches the user's current goal. That is why consent design is part user experience and part data governance. The first major design decision in a consent journey is timing, because timing shapes comprehension. Asking for consent at the moment a user needs a feature can be helpful, because the purpose is clear and the user can connect the request to a benefit. Asking too early can feel abstract and coercive, and asking too late can feel deceptive because the user might have already shared information without understanding the implications. Timing also matters for changes, because if processing expands later, the journey should include a moment where the user can understand the change and decide again, rather than quietly updating a policy. A beginner pitfall is to treat consent as a one-time onboarding event, but real systems evolve, and a consent journey should include reconsent when the meaning of the processing changes materially. This is also where change management intersects with privacy design, because teams need a trigger that recognizes when a change in data use alters the consent story. On the exam, questions about consent often test whether you can identify when a new use requires a new decision and a new communication moment. Choosing the best answer often means choosing the option that aligns consent timing with the actual decision point. The next design decision is clarity of the ask, because users cannot choose what they cannot understand. Clarity means describing the purpose in plain language, avoiding vague statements that cover everything, and explaining what data is involved in a way that matches the user's mental model. For example, saying we use information to improve services is too broad to support meaningful consent if the real use includes profiling, cross-context sharing, or sensitive inference. Clarity also means describing what will happen if the user says no, because users often fear that saying no will break the product or degrade the experience in unexpected ways. A strong consent journey makes the consequences explicit and fair, such as explaining that the user will still have core functionality but will not receive certain personalized suggestions. Beginners sometimes think clarity requires long paragraphs, but long text often reduces comprehension. So clarity is about precision and relevance rather than volume. It also helps to separate essential facts from optional detail, so users get what they need to decide without being overwhelmed. For exam reasoning, clarity is a proxy for trustworthiness, and answer choices that improve specificity and reduce ambiguity often reflect the correct direction. Meaningful choice is the third major design decision, and it is where many systems fail by making consent technically present but practically coerced. Meaningful choice means the user can refuse optional processing without losing access to core features that do not require that processing. It also means the option to refuse is not hidden behind extra steps or presented in a way that makes it feel like an error. Meaningful choice includes symmetry, meaning it should be as easy to decline as to accept, and it should be as easy to withdraw as it was to give. Consent journeys often break when withdrawal is hard, because withdrawal is treated as a threat to analytics rather than as a user right. A privacy technologist advising on consent should be able to identify when a design is making refusal overly painful or confusing, because that is a sign of manipulation rather than respect. In exam scenarios, manipulative choice design often appears as a subtle detail, like a flow that pushes users to accept by default or hides the decline option. The best answer usually moves the design towards symmetry and genuine optionality. A consent journey also needs to handle granularity thoughtfully, because users rarely want a single giant consent that covers unrelated activities. Granularity means breaking consent into meaningful categories that align with different purposes, such as necessary service operations, optional personalization, and optional sharing with partners. The challenge is that too much granularity can overwhelm users, while too little granularity can create ambiguity and distrust. The goal is to match granularity to user understanding and to actual data flow separation, because offering granular choices that the system cannot enforce is worse than offering fewer choices that are truly honored. This is where engineering reality matters, because you need to know whether the architecture can respect different consent states across downstream services and vendors. Beginners sometimes assume you can offer unlimited choice and figure out enforcement later, but that creates operational chaos and broken promises. A better approach is to start with a small number of meaningful categories that map to real processing boundaries, then expand only when enforcement is reliable. On the exam, answers that mention aligning consent categories to actual processing purposes and enforceable boundaries tend to reflect mature thinking. Enforcement is the backbone of a consent journey, because without enforcement, the journey becomes a story users are told rather than a choice they control. Enforcement means the user's consent state is recorded accurately, applied consistently across all processing paths, and propagated to downstream systems, including analytics stores and third-party services. It also means consent state changes, like withdrawal, are applied in a timely way and are not overridden by caching, replication, or outdated copies of preferences. A common beginner misunderstanding is to think consent is enforced only at the interface, like whether a toggle is on or off, but real enforcement must occur in back-end workflows where data is collected, exported, and used. In complex cloud environments, enforcement can fail because different services have different sources of truth, or because third parties do not receive updated preference signals. A privacy technologist needs to think like a systems person here, asking where the consent state is stored, how it is referenced, and how it is applied at each point in the data flow. Exam questions often test for this by describing a system that has consent but still processes data after opt-out, and the best answer usually includes fixing propagation and data flow gating. A consent journey also needs auditability, not because users want a spreadsheet, but because accountability depends on being able to show what happened when questions arise. Auditability means you can demonstrate when consent was obtained, what the user was told at the time, what purpose the consent covered, and how the system enforced that consent. This is especially important when processing changes over time, because the meaning of consent can depend on the version of the notice or the wording presented at the moment of choice. It also matters for dispute resolution, because users may claim they never consented or that they withdrew consent, and the organization needs accurate records to investigate and correct issues. Auditability should be designed in a privacy-respecting way, meaning you avoid storing unnecessary detail about user behavior just to prove consent, and you protect consent records as sensitive because they can reveal user preferences. Beginners sometimes think auditability is only for regulators, but it is also for internal quality control because it helps teams detect when enforcement is broken. On the exam, answers that include maintaining accurate consent records and tying them to system enforcement often reflect mature program design. Consent journeys must also be designed to avoid consent fatigue, because when users are asked too often, they stop thinking and start clicking. Consent fatigue is not a user failure. It is a design failure, because the system is placing too much cognitive burden on people. A privacy-respecting design asks for consent only when it is truly needed and when the choice is meaningful, and it uses other design approaches, like minimization and purpose limitation, to reduce how often consent is required. It also avoids bundling unrelated requests into one giant prompt, because that encourages users to accept without understanding. Another strategy is to provide reminders and accessible settings, so users can revisit choices later without being interrupted constantly. Consent fatigue matters for trust because users who feel pestered may disengage, and users who feel tricked may complain when they later discover what they agreed to. The exam can probe this by describing a product with constant pop-ups or confusing prompts, and the best answer usually involves simplifying the consent experience while strengthening transparency and control. Cross-device and cross-context consistency is another challenge in consent journeys, especially in modern systems where users interact through web, mobile, and connected devices. Users expect that a choice they make in one place will be respected everywhere, and inconsistency feels like a broken promise even if it is caused by technical complexity. This means consent state should be treated as a shared, authoritative signal that can be referenced by all relevant services. It also means the user should be able to find and manage their choices in a predictable place, not only at the moment of request. Beginners sometimes assume consent is tied to a single device or session, but that is rarely acceptable for privacy expectations, especially for choices about marketing, sharing, and sensitive processing. A privacy technologist should consider whether consent is per account, per device, per feature, or per context, and ensure that decision is clearly communicated and enforced. This is also where third-party integration matters, because vendors must receive and honor the same consent signals if they are involved in processing. Exam scenarios often involve inconsistency across systems, and the best answer usually addresses the single source of truth and propagation. Withdrawal and change management are also part of a consent journey, because consent that cannot be withdrawn easily is not trustworthy. Withdrawal should be as simple as giving consent, and it should lead to real changes in processing, not just changes in a settings display. That requires the system to stop future processing for the withdrawn purpose and, where appropriate, to address data already collected, such as ceasing certain uses and potentially deleting or delinking data if the use cannot continue legitimately. Withdrawal also needs clear communication because users should understand what will change and what will remain, especially when some processing is necessary for core functionality. Beginners sometimes think withdrawal is a rare edge case, but it is a central part of trust because it signals user control. Change management matters because consent journeys can be disrupted when features evolve, and users may need to be asked again when the meaning of processing changes. A mature design includes triggers for reconsent and clear explanation of what is new. On the exam, answers that include supporting withdrawal and ensuring downstream enforcement often reflect the correct understanding of consent as an ongoing relationship rather than a moment. Consent journeys also intersect with special populations and vulnerability because not all users have the same ability to understand, navigate, or resist pressure. Ethical design means you consider readability, accessibility, and the risk of manipulation, especially for users who may have limited literacy, limited time, or limited familiarity with technology. It also means you avoid designs that exploit urgency or fear, like suggesting the user will be unsafe unless they accept tracking, unless that is truly the case and clearly explained. In some contexts, consent may not be the appropriate basis for processing because power imbalance can undermine voluntariness, such as when users feel they have no real choice. While the exam is not asking you to become a legal specialist, it does expect you to recognize that voluntariness is part of meaningful consent. Designing consent journeys that respect users means designing with empathy and realism, not with an assumption that everyone will read carefully and act perfectly. This is another reason defaults matter so much, because good defaults protect users who never touch settings. Exam questions may hint at coercion or confusing flows, and the stronger answer usually improves clarity, reduces pressure, and strengthens genuine optionality. To make all of this usable under exam pressure, you can rely on a calm mental checklist that stays focused on user experience and system enforcement without turning into a mechanical script. Start by asking whether consent is actually needed for the described processing, or whether minimization and purpose limitation could reduce the need for consent prompts. Then ask whether the user will understand the purpose and consequences at the moment they are asked, and whether the timing matches the decision point. Next, ask whether the choice is meaningful, including whether refusal is allowed without unfair penalty and whether the design avoids manipulation. Then ask whether the consent is granular in a way that maps to real processing boundaries and can be enforced reliably across systems and vendors. After that, ask how consent state is stored, propagated, and audited, including how withdrawal is handled and how changes are communicated over time. Finally, ask whether the journey supports trust by being consistent, accessible, and honest. When you can run this checklist mentally, you can evaluate consent scenarios quickly and choose answers that reflect mature privacy technology practice. When you can design consent journeys users understand and choose, you are creating an experience where transparency, autonomy, and enforcement align, which is one of the most important foundations of privacy trust. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, CIPT, exam, this matters because consent is often tested indirectly through scenarios involving unexpected processing, confusing settings, or broken opt-out enforcement. A strong consent journey starts with clear purpose and well-timed communication, offers meaningful and symmetrical choices, and is backed by system design that enforces the user's decision across all relevant data flows. It also includes withdrawal, auditability, and change management so consent remains meaningful as systems evolve. If you treat consent as a relationship rather than a moment, you will naturally design for consistency and respect, and your answers on the exam will reflect that maturity. Most importantly, you will be able to distinguish between consent theater and real consent, and you will know what practical steps turn the theater into something users can actually trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.